Hello, my name's Benjamin Carter. I'm delighted to be able to share with you some of the insights that we've learnt in a project called God's Tent, which I began in my old parishes on Hadrian's Wall and continue to do in work at Carlisle Cathedral. I'm sorry I can't be with you this evening, but I hope this short presentation is just a little taste of some of the opportunities that God's Tent's given us both in parish and also here at the cathedral. And I'd be delighted to continue a conversation about God's Tent with anybody who'd be interested to talk to me about it. And my contact details will be at the end of this presentation. So to begin with, what is God's Tent? Well, God's Tent began life as a solution to three overlapping challenges we had in the parishes where I was vicar on Hadrian's Wall. The first was that we were encountering a group of children, some of whom you can see here, who were just beginning to sort of stretch at the edges of what we could offer through things like Messy Church or our traditional Sunday school. The second was that we had some wonderful buildings in beautiful locations, but not a great deal of practical space that we could use to offer the things that you might normally do for children of that age, like activity groups or youth clubs. And the third was that we were blessed to live in and be based in some of the most wonderful landscapes in the Church of England. You might be able to see over the shoulders of the children in this picture that this is taken right on Hadrian's Wall at High Shield Crags. And I was fortunate as vicar to have a national park, a World Heritage Site, and an area of outstanding natural beauty within the parish boundaries. And so we wanted to get out of our church buildings and into that landscape. And we found that a tent, literally a 6-metre bell tent, helped solve all three of those challenges. It was fun for the children and their families. It was a good, easy, flexible space to use. The tent went up and down, goes up and down in 20 minutes by two relatively fit people. And thirdly, it encouraged us, in fact, compelled us to get out of our church buildings and into that landscape. So God's Tent as an idea was, and a form and pattern of worship was something that we developed over a few years, and quite quickly it formed in terms of worship and pattern of worship and liturgy into a simple structure, which I've outlined here. This wasn't so much the structure, but the space that we tried to create when we worshipped in God's Tent. The first was that we always wanted to have at the heart of what we did, scripture, a story from the Bible, or a pattern of scripture that we wanted to explore. And we would try to do that exploration through something from the tradition of the church. But the means of that exploration was in the landscapes around us. So an example of that would be that on one occasion we explored the stations of the cross and then the stations of the resurrection. So those wonderful stories, both of Holy Week and Easter, and then of the resurrection, but through those given and well-known traditions of the stations of the cross, but as a scavenger hunt going around some woods where we were. This is a photograph of when we were trying to think about the story of Joseph and dreaming and slowing ourselves down. And so these families had been on a slow treasure hunt through those woods, looking for the fifth leaf they could find or the thing that was furthest away. And in doing so, encouraging us to slow down. And then we built a labyrinth in the woods and allowed the children and the families to walk in that labyrinth to explore that story. It was really important for us in God's Tent that scripture was at the heart of what we offered and what we explored, but we did so in a way which was in sympathy with and in tune with the traditional patterns of worship in the life of the church, but using the natural world as the means of that exploration and understanding. One of the other aspects of God's Tent, which became really important to us and continues to be important as we explore God's Tent now, I've moved to Carlisle Cathedral, is that it really was a community of worship and a community of faith. There was something about God's Tent which, if you excuse the language, was like a church plant. There was a core group of people who wanted to be there and gather there each month, and that helped give us the confidence to plan and organise it. But in doing so, they would draw other people to that. It allowed us in quite diverse and disparate rural communities to go to where people were. So this was a pitching of God's Tent we did at a farm on the north side of the Tyne Valley, where we were able to go to that farmer's farm and meet with the farming family there and with their friends, but also take our core God's Tent community with us. And it created a sense of confidence and a sense of ownership of God's Tent that went beyond the fact that the vicar thought this was a good idea and wanted other people to do it. Here in Carlisle Diocese, we're beginning to use God's Tent as the cathedral as a way of resourcing the local church and going to local places and going to where people are to share these stories in the natural world. And in doing so, to create our own community for God's Tent, but in this case, drawn from clergy families and families of people in ministry, where sometimes it's harder for people to find a place where you can just be yourself with your family. It's early days, but it's a really interesting and exciting way of using the resource. And at the heart of it, that sense of building and drawing together a community, a core community, who then are able to share as that community what the insights and the life of God's Tent. The observant of you will have noticed that the use of a tent isn't just an accidental one. It is a really powerful and important metaphor all the way through Scripture of understanding who Jesus is for us and who God for us is in Jesus. The idea of God through the wilderness, being with the people of Israel in a tent pitched among them, which was then a metaphor that the gospel writer to the Gospel of John picks up and speaks of the word becoming flesh and literally pitching his tent among us. And that was a really important and powerful image that we used and continue to use in the worship in God's tent, that to pitch the tent is to create a sacred space in the landscape and to articulate the presence of God in that physical way. And alongside that, a way of understanding what it is to encounter and know God through the worship of God in a tent, which is different from worshiping God in a temple. And one of the things which I've always found very exciting is that way in which God's tent allows us to hold in tension those two pictures of how we worship God, either worshiping and finding God in a temple or in a tent. This is a picture of God's tent in the churchyard of one of my old parishes in the Tyne Valley in the Diocese of Newcastle. And it was a wonderful space to create an alternative space alongside the traditional church space of the parish church there. But now in Carlisle Diocese, as a cathedral, the biggest temple, if you will, within the life of the diocese, it's wonderful to be able to share some of the resource and some of the identity and some of the ongoing story of the cathedral with people in their own places through the worship and through the activity of the tent. An important both and model of ministry within the life of the church, where we can too often, particularly when we look at alternative forms of worship, see those as in a conflict with or in tension with traditional and inherited patterns of worship. That was a very much a whistle-stop tour of some of the ideas and things that we found out about God's tent. I've been fortunate to be able to put some of those ideas down on paper and published a short book on God's tent, published by Sacristy Press, which is available from all good bookshops. I've also put there my email address at Carlisle Cathedral, Canon Warden at carlislecathedral.org.uk, and would be delighted to continue this conversation either with members of the wider Praxis network, if that's the right way to do this, or individuals if you'd like me to talk about it. It's one of those patterns and forms of worship in the outdoors, which I think you have to really experience to really truly understand the benefits of it. And I hope it's an idea that you might want to explore yourself more in the future. So again, sorry I can't be with you this evening. I'm sorry this was such a brief overview of what we're doing, but I do hope it's a helpful taster for what the possibilities of finding God pitched among us in God's tent could be like for you. Thank you.